back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of, or our beginning discussion of, the age of European exploration, right? We started talking about in class, like really setting the foundation for European exploration, European exchange, and the creation of European kingdoms that will span the Atlantic and the Pacific like oceans and eventually lead to the expansion of European empires that will lead to wars and really big stuff, right? So the thing you need to understand is that the things that we're about to get into, the things we're about to talk about, the stuff that we're about to discuss in this unit is going to be heavily reverberating throughout all of history, right? It's really going to expand. It's really going to continue to grow. And it's really going to affect the progression of Western civilization's history for centuries to come, right? Centuries to come. But the big things that we talked about in class, right? We talked about some things to remember that the Europeans mostly at this point are trying to get to that monsoon marketplace, right? Where those goods that they really want, like spices, silks, luxury items, already existed but were very, very expensive. We talked about how the Italians and the Byzantinians dominated that early trade market up to 1453 when the Byzantine then becomes the Ottoman Empire, right? And we also talked about how the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the age of European exploration are all going on at the same time, but we left off talking about how the Europeans weren't even going to be able to try and break into this trade market until they had the proper necessary inventions to do so. But the interesting thing about these inventions, quote unquote, is that some people already had them. And it's mostly the Arabs and also the Italians at this point. Now, the reason why I have inventions in quotes is because most of the things that we're about to talk about, actually all three of the things that we're going to talk about that all start with C, okay? Like, so actually had already been invented by basically Arab or Islamic traders and Italian ones as well. Because what happened was the Arabs and the the Arabs actually learned from the Asians and the Africans as well how to make some of these devices for long-distance trading, and the Arabs then perfected them and made them better. And then when the Arabs began to trade with the Italians, like the Venetians and stuff like that, the city, of course, Venetians is the people who lived in Venice, that one merchant city who brought all the items in. When they began to actually trade with them, cultural diffusion will take place, and slowly these devices will make their way into Europe, and Europeans will learn how to use them, right? And the three big ones that we're going to talk about, I'll start with C, start off with one right here. Cartography, right? Cartography is one of the very serious inventions that needed to happen so Europeans could explore like these different areas and start trying to find new trade routes, right? Cartography, and like is a very fancy word for the science of map making, right? Making effective maps using longitude and latitude lines so you know your position on the Earth. Now, there's a lot of other devices that are involved with this for anybody who's listening to this on YouTube right now. And there's like, well, what about the astrolabe and the sextant and the quadrant? Yes, all right, those devices go together, though, to make the science of cartography. Right? So or making like cartography possible, right? Now, speaking of cartography, now that I have a map, now I need to know what direction I'm going. So the compass is going to be brought in, which was perfected by the Arabs, right? Magnetic compasses that actually can tell you if you're pointing towards the magnetic north pole of the Earth were going to be very, very important. By the way, fun fact, you can actually make a compass using just a leaf, a puddle, and a paperclip, right? Because literally it will be attractive. We got to scrape the paperclip a little bit to actually line up the magnetic poles of it, and then it will eventually actually point north, right? So the compass is a very, very important device that will actually point its direction north and give these sailors some bearing and direction so they can know where they're going, right? And the Arabs have been using this thing for over 100 years, and then already perfected the use of it in general and combined it with that science of cartography, right? Now, caravels is another really, really big one. Speaking of particularly Iberian caravels, which are going to be very, very perfected items based off Arab trade vessels, but caravels are lighter, triangular sailed ships, right? So if you look at this back here, this triangular sail in the back of the actual boat can catch wind going both forward and backwards as well, right? It can actually make it so that the ship itself can travel into the wind or against it in both directions, right? These caravel ships, though, are also going to be fantastic trade vessels because they allow for longer stretches on the water without getting lost and being able to actually zigzag their way through the wind, right? So going into it, though, but where do the Europeans want to get to? And what do they want? Now, this is really, really big, okay? So now that the Europeans have cartography, compass, caravels, they have the devices necessary for actually sailing, but where do these people want to get to? Where do they want to go so bad, right? Well, the place they want to go is actually into that monsoon marketplace, right? So we're talking about breaking into that monsoon marketplace, and breaking into is really, really an operative term. The Europeans ultimately wanted to get to India and the Indian Ocean. That was where they wanted to get to more than anything else because it was a central access point within that monsoon marketplace that had a lot of access to goods that they wanted particularly that were worth a lot of money back in Europe, right? The most valued item, though, at the time, were spices, right? Spices coming mostly from the Indian subcontinent, right? Spices are going to be very, very important for a lot of different reasons. But the spices that grow naturally in India due to the very, very humid and very, very damp and then also very warm climate are going to be essential market items that are going to make Europeans tons of money. Like, to give you a little bit of heads up, these right here are examples of spices, things like turmeric, cinnamon, black pepper, cloves, coriander, and red chili. The most important of all those spices, though, is none other than black pepper. Black peppercorns that actually grow off of pepper plants that actually grow in India was like, if you had black pepper on your table in Europe before all this really, really went down, it was like having a Ferrari in the garage, right? Like, for example, in the Dutch language, when Dutch people speak to one another, they have a phrase that has eked its way into their actual language. And when they actually say it to each other, it's like a colloquial saying, kind of like whenever Americans are just like, oh, I gotta, like, I don't know, what's a funny little saying that Americans have? So for example, like in New Orleans with all the EAUX, right, and like all that kind of stuff, the bro marks, bro bears, and like the actual like infiltration of like regular other words into their language, the Dutch have a friendly saying where they say, oh, it's pepperly expensive. Actually referring back to the fact that the Dutch actually traded in some of these early spices later on, and it meant that pepper was just that expensive back in the day, right? So in the 1400s, if you had black pepper on your table, it's like having a Ferrari in the garage, right? So the thing about it, though, is what about these spices can you use them for other than, like, flavoring things, okay? We have to understand that spices have very, very distinct uses, right? One, they can preserve food. They can also flavor that food. They are also very, very good for making medicine, right? Certain things in peppers, there's a chemical inside of peppers known as capsaicin, and capsaicin actually opens up your sinuses and makes it easier to breathe. So if you have like a cold or something like that, it'll flush all that stuff out. It also makes luxury items, much like perfume, right? But how do they get there, right? Like, how are they going to get there? This is going to be really, really big when we're talking about the growth of European exploration, okay? So something we need to remember and understand is that I'm going to use my face to cover up this side of the map because the Europeans are operating based on a limited knowledge of the globe, right? They want to get to India, which is right there, okay? So we need to understand where they're trying to get to. They're trying to get here, which is India on this map, right? And they're located here in Europe. So how are you going to get from Europe all the way to India? Well, some of y'all are like, well, Mr. Terry, can't you just go along the map right here and just walk like a trade caravan all the way to India? Well, funny enough, no, you can't. That's a really, really great question. But the problem is that the Muslim kingdoms actually control all of northern Africa and all this area in the Middle East. And ever since the Crusades, they do not allow Christian traders to pass through their areas, right? Because they'll actually like arrest them and possibly end up executing them and stuff like that if they actually get busted or caught trying to actually move different items through Arab kingdoms, right? So the Arabs locked this area down. Now some of you are like, well, can't you go up and around them like into Russia and stuff? Well, no, because it's so cold in this area, right? It's frigid in this area. And there's also a huge mountain range right above India known as the Himalayas that you can't come in through the northern area from, okay? It's very, very cold. Also, the Mongols live out here, and the Mongols, as of the 1400s, are going to also convert to Islam. So they can't go in this direction either. Some of you are like, well, what if I just cut through Africa right here? This is also the Sahara, so you can't go that way either. So they have two ideas, right? One group of people is going to decide, I'm just going to head west, and I'm going to try to pop up on the other side of the earth, right? We'll talk about that guy a little bit later, but then another group's like, we got to go all the way around Africa, right? So the number one thing you have to notice is those inventions, that technology, those boats, all that stuff is going to be necessary because they have to take water routes to get to the prized possession of getting to India to get into that spice market, right? So that's going to be really, really important that you understand so you can do a little bit better on this entire test and understand this unit a little bit better. But you can't go to the east because the Muslims are going to prevent you from going through that way. Can't go through the north because the climate's too cold in Russia, and also the Himalayas are going to stand in your way. And then also going into it as well, can't go through the middle of Africa because the Sahara Desert's there, right? Yeah, also, by the way, don't say Sahara Desert. That's actually dumb because it's saying, like, desert. Now, anyway, so who are the first two countries do we think are going to strike out, though, and get after it and go all the way to India? Well, actually, I'll go ahead and answer it for you. It's none other than the two European countries of Portugal and Spain, right? Portugal and Spain are going to be the very first two places that are going to try and strike out and get to India as fast as they can, right? By the way, you might want to go ahead and check Google Classroom, because I'm going to go ahead and post pretty soon a map that you're going to be using for a map quiz next week, right? So make sure you go ahead and double check Google Classroom for the next couple of days, and that's going to be very, very important so you can do really well going into next week, right? So the thing that we need to understand, though, is the Portuguese, right, the people from Portugal right here on this side, and the people from Spain, okay, or the Spanish, are going to have two different strategies when it comes to getting to India as quickly as they can. Well, the Portuguese strategy is going to start with a very, very old idea of let's go around Africa, right? They're going to decide that they're going to try and lily pad leap all the way over around Africa, funded mostly by their king, Henry the Navigator, right? Well, actually not their king, he's a prince. He's Prince Henry the Navigator. He's actually a brother to the king at the time. And they, being the little country right here on this map, the Portuguese are going to try and bounce their way all the way around Africa to get to India over here in the Indian Ocean. So as you can tell, knowing maps is pretty important for this unit, okay? Now, this is going to take decades to actually accomplish, right? Because they start this whole process right around 1450 to get there, and they're going to have a lot of different failed attempts, right? They're going to have different explorers that try to make it all the way there. They're going to set up trade outposts on the Azores Islands, and then they're also, though, going to start setting up forts along the western coast of Africa. And the Portuguese are going to be the ones that begin the African-based slave trade system that is going to become very, very important as we discuss this later on. Because we're going to discuss how awful that thing was, how disgusting it was, and how basically it's going to lead to the spreading of African people in a diaspora throughout other areas of the planet, right? But they're going to be the ones that actually begin to create those forts and begin that slave trade system, right? Now, by 1497, that's when they finally pull it off, right? By 1497, one guy by the name of Vasco da Gama actually makes it all the way around Africa and gets all the way to India, because the biggest area that they were concerned about was this area down here at the southern tip of Africa, which one earlier sailor by the name of Bartholomew Diaz actually referred to it as the Cape of Storms, because it was so bad and so weathery and so tumultuous and filled with just these like really, really, really bad weather patterns, he could never make it past there. Well, Vasco da Gama is the first guy to take 4 vessels all the way around that area and get all the way to India and bring out stuff all the way back. And as the very first Portuguese sailor to make it all the way to India and get all the way back, he makes a ton of money off of the spices that come back. Because remember, y'all, spices were very expensive, okay? And they were very expensive because they traded hands so many times. But this guy, just before Portugal, went all the way there, picked the spices up directly from the source, and went all the way back, saving Portugal a lot of money. They were able to charge us a little bit less for their spices, and they sold them wholesale real quick, right? Making a ton of money for the Portuguese government, and also a ton of money for himself. And then also another big thing we need to understand, though, is because he made it past that southern tip of Africa, became known as the Cape of Good Hope, right? It was located down here. That right there is the Cape of Good Hope, right? Because he said, look, if you can get past there, you're home free. And you hope the fact that India is just right over there, right? But the Cape of Good Hope was at the southern tip of Africa after Vasco da Gama. By the way, a little fun fact about it as well, he also made a bunch of money because he didn't have to pay a lot of his sailors because a bunch of them died from a disease known as scurvy, right? So, like, now looking into it, though, we'll talk about how half of his sailors died from scurvy in class a little bit. We'll talk about how gross a disease scurvy is and stuff like that and how it literally makes your teeth fall out. But the other thing you need to understand, though, speaking about breaking into the monster marketplace, is the Portuguese are going to be the very first people to go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, get to India in 1497, and come all the way back. But something that some of y'all probably know, I know Addison Persons right now is just like, wait a minute, but I thought Columbus was in 1492. He was. Columbus actually sailed 5 years before that, right? And he actually had already ran into 2 brand new continents that nobody actually knew anything about. But something we need to understand is he sailed for Spain, even though he himself is Italian, right? So, like, Columbus, an Italian sailor, had the idea to go west, right? And he was like, look, I'm going to head west from Spain, and I'm going to pop up on the other side of the world, right? He actually went to a bunch of Italian government workers first. He went to Genoa, he went to France, trying to beg them for this idea. And he was like, look, I need boats. I need boats to get there, right? And he had the idea to go west, pop up on the other side of the world, and go to India from a southern route. Well, he finally found some suitors after multiple failed attempts, and the suitors are going to be the financiers, the royals of the Spanish crown, by the name of Isabella and Ferdinand. And they're very, very important. As the king and queen of Spain, they're grandma and grandpa to a very important person that we've actually talked about. Charles V, the same guy that told the Pope to tell Henry VIII no from divorcing his aunt, Catherine of Aragon. He is the grandchild of Isabella and Ferdinand, king and queen of Spain, the same people that gave Columbus the money and the ships and the stuff to go off to try and find, like, his way to get to India, right? Well, the thing about it is he took 3 ships from them and also a 90-10% contract where basically the financiers, or like Isabella and Ferdinand, were like, whatever you find, we get 90% of it, you get 10, right? The thing about it is he took the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, the 3 boats given to him by the Spanish royals, and he found a lot of stuff because he ran into 2 continents nobody ever knew was there. Because after 3 months, Columbus's voyage is going to land in the Bahamas on accident in August of 1492, beginning a huge incursion of Spanish forces into those different areas and leading to a takeover and a colonizing of these areas by Spanish forces. And then also kind of creating a salivating like attempt of like other places like England and France. We're going to want to go off and do the same thing. But more on that later as well. And then tomorrow, whenever we actually get into class, we're going to talk about how they're going to cut up the world and they're going to actually divide the entire thing and keep them from fighting over it a little bit with each other. But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.